Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction and for the invitation today. I should add that actually this morning I came from Cambridge, so it really wasn't that bad. Now, to set the historical context, I'd like to begin by pointing out that we've only just passed the 62nd anniversary of Stalin's death. And in commemoration of that event, I'd like to read a very short excerpt from the memoirs of his daughter Svetlana, who sat by his deathbed until the very end. And for the last 12 hours, she wrote, "The lack of oxygen became acute. The death agony was terrible. He literally choked to death as we watched. At what seemed to be the very last moment, he opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance, insane, or perhaps angry, and full of the fear of death." Within days of Stalin's demise, his henchmen Beria and then Khrushchev began dismantling one of the Soviet leader's signature achievements, namely his concentration camps. They did so for many reasons. Some had wives and relatives in the camps. Some feared retribution from others who did. Most of all, however, they did so because the camps were an economic disaster, about which more in a moment, and potentially a political disaster too. No one knew better than Stalin's Politburo just how many people imprisoned within them were innocent. Yet, although they knew this, none of Stalin's Soviet successors, not Nikita Khrushchev, not Brezhnev, and not in the end even Mikhail Gorbachev, was far-seeing enough or politically powerful enough to finish the job, to destroy the camps, and also to fully dismantle their legacy. And as a result, both the economic and the moral legacy of the camps continue to distort Russian society today. One might say that Stalin is dead, but his last terrible gaze still casts its shadow. But although the legacy of the Gulag and of Stalinism will be the ultimate subject of my talk today, I do want to begin with a brief account of what we have learned about Stalin's system, and particularly about his camps, since the time of his death, and in particular what we know now that we did not know 20 years ago. For in the years that I spent researching my book on the Gulag, I concluded that archives can make a big difference to how we understand Soviet history. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, I was able to work in archives in Moscow and Karelia, and I had access to archives from documents from archives in St. Petersburg, Perm, Vorkuta, Kolyma, and Novosibirsk. At one point, I was handed part of the archive of a small camp called Kudrovy Shore in the far north, and I was politely asked if I wanted to buy it, which I did. It's now at the Hoover Institution. What was available to me was often quite ordinary. The day-to-day archive of the Gulag administration, for example, with inspectors' reports and financial accounts, letters from directors to Moscow. But when reading these documents, the full extent of the system and its importance to the Soviet economy and society comes abruptly into focus. Thanks to archives, we now know, for example, that there were at least 476 camp systems inside the Soviet Union, each one made up of hundreds or even thousands of individual camps or lagpunkts, sometimes spread out over thousands of square miles of otherwise empty tundra. We know that the vast majority of prisoners in them were peasants and workers and not the intellectuals who later wrote memoirs and books. We know that with a few exceptions, the camps were not constructed in order to kill people. Stalin preferred to use firing squads for mass executions. Nevertheless, they were at times very lethal. Nearly a quarter of the Gulag's prisoners died during the war years. And I would hesitate to add, when you use statistics about the war, Gulag prisoners who died during the war are also included in those statistics. And so you have to watch out for the Soviet Union's description of its own role during the war. They were also very fluid. Prisoners left because they died, because they escaped, because they had short sentences, because they were being released into the Red Army, or because they'd been promoted, as happened sometimes in the Gulag, from prisoner to guard. There were also frequent amnesties for the old and the ill, or anyone else who was no longer useful to the forced labor system, though these releases were invariably followed by new waves of arrests. As a result, between 1929, when they first became a mass phenomenon, and 1953, the year of Stalin's death, some 18 million people passed through the Soviet Gulag. In addition, a further 6 or 7 million people were deported not to camps but to exile villages, And in total, that means that the number of people with some experience of imprisonment in Stalin's Soviet Union could have run as high as 25 million, or about 15% of the population. Not all of those imprisoned were Soviet citizens, of course. And in the course of writing another book, my second book on the Soviet repression of Eastern Europe after the war, I also uncovered the extent of Stalin's camps in that part of the world, too. After the war's end, 6 new concentration camps, Soviet-run in fact by the staff of the Gulag, were opened in eastern Germany. 2 of them, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, on the very same sites that had been used by Hitler. More than 150,000 people were sentenced to these camps, of whom about a third died of starvation and illness. I should say that the process of deciding who in Germany would be sent to these camps was very arbitrary, and though the Russians claimed at the time that these were Nazis, in fact, many of them were young people. Many of them were, in essence, people whom the system had identified as future enemies. Lenin was very keen on fighting future enemies as well as present ones. So the camps were a source of violence from the very beginning, from really the first days of that occupation. In Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria also opened prison work camps. In Poland, there were mass arrests, but no camps, because Polish prisoners were sent straight into the Soviet Gulag, and many ended up with Soviet prisoners. Unlike Soviet prisoners, these foreign prisoners could end up absolutely anywhere. Although we're all familiar with the image of the prisoner in the snowstorm digging coal with a pickaxe, there were also camps in central Moscow. Where prisoners built apartment blocks or designed airplanes. Famously, there's a whole section of Moscow which is supposed to have been built by German prisoners of war. And allegedly, this is why the buildings look better than some other buildings built right after the war. There are camps in Krasnoyarsk where prisoners ran nuclear power plants, and there are fishing camps, or were fishing camps, on the Pacific coast. The Gulag photo albums in the Russian state archives are chock full of pictures of prisoners with their camels. From Akhtubinsk to Yakutsk, there was not a single major population center that did not have its own local camp or camps, and not a single industry that did not employ prisoners. So over the years, prisoners built roads and railroads, power plants and chemical factories. They manufactured weapons, furniture, and even children's toys. Now, in the Soviet Union of the 1940s, the decade that the camps reached their zenith, the 40s, not the 30s, it would have been difficult in many places to go about your daily business and not run into prisoners. In other words, it is no longer possible to argue, as some Western historians once did, that the camps were known only to a small portion of the population. We also understand better the chronology of the camps and the chronology of Stalinist terror. We've long known that Stalin built the first ones in 1918 at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution as an ad hoc emergency measure to contain enemies of the people, to prevent counter-revolution, and to re-educate the bourgeoisie. And we know that he and his successors expanded these camps to the Solovetsky Islands, a small group of islands in the north of in the White Sea in the early 1920s. But archives have also helped explain why Stalin chose to expand them again in 1929. In that year, Stalin launched the 5-year plan, which was an extraordinarily costly attempt in human lives and natural resources to force a 20% annual increase in the Soviet Union's industrial output and to collectivize agriculture. The plan led to millions of arrests as peasants were forced off their land and imprisoned if they refused. Eventually, it helped lead to a massive famine in the Republic of Ukraine, which was then accelerated by Stalin to increase it. And it also led to an enormous labor shortage. Suddenly, the Soviet Union found itself in need of gas, coal, and minerals, most of which could be found only in the far north of the country. So, following a series of discussions which used almost exclusively economic language to justify the expansion of the camps, the decision was taken. Prisoners should be used to extract these minerals. And to the secret policemen who were charged with carrying out the construction of the camps, this made sense. And here's how one of them, Alexei Loginov, who's the former deputy commander of the Norilsk camps north of the Arctic Circle, justified the use of prisoner labor in a 1992 interview. He said, "If we had sent civilians there, we would first have had to build houses for them to live in. And how could civilians live there? With prisoners, it is easy. All you need is a barrack, a stove with a chimney, and they survive." Prisoners in Gulag documents are often referred to as contingente, contingents. From the point of view of the Soviet leadership and of camp commanders, they were an ingredient in production, like lumps of coal or bars of steel. Enemies of the people didn't need to live like civilians in normal houses, and of course, this is what made them cheaper and more expendable. None of which is to say that the camps, in addition to their economic function, were not also intended to terrorize and subjugate the population. Certainly, prison and camp regimes, which were dictated in minute detail by Moscow, were openly designed to humiliate prisoners. The prisoners' buttons, belts, garters, and items made of elastic were taken away from them. They were described as enemies. They were forbidden to use the word comrade. Such gestures contributed to the dehumanization of prisoners in the eyes of camp guards and bureaucrats, who therefore found it that much easier not to treat them as fellow citizens, and let alone as human beings. And in fact, this turned out to be an extremely powerful ideological combination, the disregarding of the humanity of prisoners combined with the overwhelming need to fulfill the plan. Nowhere is this clearer than in camp inspection reports, which were submitted periodically by local prosecutors and are now kept neatly on file in the Moscow archives. When I first began to read them, I was quite shocked at first, both by their frankness and by the peculiar kind of outrage they express. So describing conditions in Volgolag, a railroad construction company in Tatarstan in July 1942, one inspector complained, for example, that the whole population of the camp, including free workers, lives off flour. The only meal for prisoners is so-called bread made from flour and water, without meats or fats. As a result, the inspector went on indignantly, there were high rates of illness, particularly scurvy, and not surprisingly, the camp was failing to meet its production norms. The outrage ceased to seem surprising after I'd read several dozen similar reports, each of which used more or less the same sort of language, and each of which ended with more or less the same ritual conclusions. Conditions needed to be improved so that prisoners would work harder, so that production norms would be met. Yet very little was actually done because, in fact, the prisoners' lives and health were not the primary concern of anybody. And the result was that while it might have been expected that living conditions in the Gulag would be poor during the war, as they were all over the Soviet Union, a nationwide inspection of 23 large camps in 1948 still concluded that 75% of the prisoners in Norilsk in northern Siberia had no warm boots, that the number of prisoners unfit for labor in Karelia had tripled, that death rates were still too high in half a dozen camps, too high, that is, to allow for efficient production. Reading these reports reminded me of the inspectors of Gogol's era. The forms were observed, the reports were filed, and the effects on actual human beings were ignored. Camp commanders were routinely reprimanded for failing to improve living conditions. Too many prisoners are dying, and that's inefficient. But living conditions continued to fail to improve, and there the discussion ended. The level of specificity also clears up any remaining doubt about who was in control of the camps and the central government or the regional bosses. Back in Moscow, they knew what camps were like, and they knew in great detail. But if so many people knew what was happening at the time, the people who survived the camps, the people who ran the camps, then why are they so rarely discussed now? And this question brings me to the next part of my talk today, appropriate for a forum on history, in which I would like to ask why the Gulag is so seldom debated and discussed by Russians. One of the things that always strikes contemporary visitors to Russia is the lack of monuments to Stalin's victims. There are a few scattered memorials, but there is no national monument or place of mourning to millions of people who died for no reason, for having been arrested arbitrarily because they might be future enemies, because they had offended somebody, because they were the envy of somebody else who denounced them. And the absence of monuments, I believe, reflects an absence of public awareness. It's true that there were wide-ranging discussions of Soviet repression in the late 1980s during Gorbachev's reign. And it's equally true that these discussions played an important role in delegitimizing the Soviet regime in the very end. But the bitter debate about justice for the victims is now completely over, and it has left no real political institutions in its wake. Although there was much talk about it at the end of the 1980s, the Russian government never did examine or try the perpetrators of torture or mass murder, even those who were identifiable. There were no truth commissions either of the sort implemented in South Africa, which might have allowed the victims to tell their stories in an official public place and make the crimes of the past a part of the public debate. The result is that half a century after the end of World War II, the Germans still conduct regular public disputes about victims' compensation, about memorials, about new interpretations of Nazi history, even about whether a younger generation of Germans ought to go on shouldering the burden of guilt about the crimes of the Nazis. Half a century, more than half a century now after Stalin's death, there are no equivalent arguments taking place in Russia because the memory of the past is not part of the public discourse, or this piece of the past. Worse, some of the very few museums and monuments, including Russia's only Gulag Museum, which is based in the former camp at Perm 36, are now being shut down. At some level, the reasons for this are not hard to fathom. Stalinist era was a long time ago, and a great deal has happened since it ended. Post-Soviet Russia is not the same as post-Soviet Germany, where the memories of the worst atrocities were still, post-Nazi Germany, where the memories of the worst atrocities were still in people's minds. Memory of the camps is also confused in Russia by the presence of so many other historical atrocities, war and famine and collectivization. Some people say, why should camp survivors get special treatment? There's also a very important question of pride. Perhaps the old system was bad, many Russians feel, but at least we were powerful. And now that we are not powerful, or we would like to become powerful again, we do not want to hear that the past was bad. Nevertheless, I would argue that the most important explanation for the lack of debate is not the fears and anxieties of ordinary Russians, but the nature of the country's new ruling class. Vladimir Putin, who's the president of Russia, is a former KGB officer who has described himself as a Chekist, deliberately using the word for Lenin's political police. Famously, the Russian president has also described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, presumably meaning greater than World Wars I or II. Under his watch, Soviet flags have returned to anniversary parades, the Soviet national anthem has been revived, and now the reconstruction of the Soviet empire is at the center of Russia's foreign policy. His intentions are clear. Putin is now trying to create an alternate vision of post-Soviet history, one which supports his ideology. Thus, in his memory, 1989 was not a moment of liberation for Eastern Europe, but the beginning of economic collapse. The hardships and deprivations in Russia in the 1990s were not the result of decades of communist neglect and widespread thievery, not least by the KGB, but of Western-style capitalism and democracy. The image he wants to project is that communism was stable and safe, and post-communism has been a disaster. Soviet Union was great. Russia, at least until now, has been a failure. And the more people believe all of this, the less likely they are to want a system which is more genuinely democratic and genuinely capitalist. The more nostalgia for Soviet-era symbols, the more secure his KGB clique is going to be. The failure to repent or discuss or even dwell upon the past is a part of this redirecting of history towards the political needs of the present rulers. It has also had consequences for the formation of Russian civil society and for the development of the rule of law. It helps explain, for example, why so many Russians are not bothered by certain kinds of censorship or by the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB, by its ability to open mail, tap telephones, and enter private residences without a court order. I think there's a deeper significance, too. To put it bluntly, if the scoundrels of the old regime not only go unpunished, but are seen to have become the victors again in the new system, then good will in no way have been seen to triumph over what was bad in the past. This may sound apocalyptic, but it's not politically irrelevant. After 1991, the secret police kept their apartments, their dachas, and their large pensions. Their victims remained poor and marginal. To most Russians, it now seems as if the more you collaborated with that system in the past, the wiser you were. By analogy, the more you cheat and lie in the present, the wiser you are now. Yet, do we in the West remember the Soviet past any better? One of the reasons I wrote my Gulag book was because I really encountered this subject only when living in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, and I started to wonder why. Until recently, it was possible to explain this absence of popular feeling about the tragedy of European communism as the logical result of a particular set of circumstances. The passage of time is part of it. Again, communist regimes really did grow less reprehensible as the years went by. Nobody was very frightened of General Jaruzelski, the last leader of Poland, or of Brezhnev, although both were responsible for a great deal of destruction. Besides, archives were closed and access to campsites was forbidden. No television cameras ever filmed the Soviet camps or their victims, as they had done in Germany at the end of the Second World War. And no images, in turn, meant that the subject in our image-driven culture didn't really exist either. I think it's also fair to say, though, that ideology twisted the ways in which we have until now, and in the past certainly, understood Soviet and East European history as well. In fact, in the 1920s, a great deal was known in the West about the bloodiness of Lenin's revolution. Western socialists, many of whose brethren had been jailed by the Bolsheviks, protested loudly and strongly against the revolution at the time. But in the 1930s, as both Americans and West Europeans became more interested in learning how socialism could be applied here, the tone changed. Writers and journalists went off to the USSR trying to learn lessons that they could use at home. The New York Times employed a correspondent, Walter Duranty, who lauded the 5-year plan and argued against all evidence that it was a massive success. And like others in this room, he won a Pulitzer Prize for doing so. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, a part of the Western left, though I should say not all of it, struggled to explain and sometimes excuse the camps and the terror which created them, precisely because they wanted to try some aspects of the Soviet experiment at home. Our determination to ignore the story of Soviet terror solidified even further during the Second World War, when Stalin was our ally. In 1944, the American Vice President, Henry Wallace, actually went to Kolyma, which was one of the most notorious camps, during a trip across the USSR. And imagining that he was visiting some kind of industrial complex, he told his host that Soviet Asia, as he called it, reminded him of the Wild West. The vast expanses of your country, her virgin forests, wide rivers and large lakes, all kinds of climate, from tropical to polar, her inexhaustible wealth remind me of my homeland, he said to them. According to a report that the boss of Kolyma later wrote for Beria, who was then the head of the security services, Wallace did ask to see prisoners, but was kept away. He was not alone in refusing to see the whole truth about Stalin's system. Roosevelt and Churchill had their photographs taken with him too. All of that has contributed until now to our firm conviction that the Second World War was a wholly just war, and that it ended in a wholly just way. And even today, few want that conviction shaken. So we remember D-Day, liberation of the Nazi camps, the children welcoming American GIs with cheers on the streets. And we do not remember that the camps of Stalin, our ally, expanded, just as the camps of Hitler, our enemy, were liberated. Nobody wants to think that we defeated one mass murderer with the help of another. During the Cold War, it is true that our awareness of Soviet atrocities went up, but in the 1960s, they receded again. Even in the 1980s, as I remember because I was a student then, there were still American academics who went on describing the advantages of East German healthcare or Polish peace initiatives. In the academic world, Soviet historians who wrote about the camps generally fell into two categories. Those who wrote about them as criminal, and those who downplayed them, if not because they were actually pro-Soviet, then they were because they were opposed to America's role in the Cold War, or maybe to Ronald Reagan. In other words, right up until the very end, our views of the Soviet Union and our understanding of its repressive system always had a lot more to do with American politics and American ideological struggles than they did with the Soviet Union itself. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, much has changed. World War II now belongs to a previous generation. Cold War is over too, and all of the alliances and international fault lines that it produced have shifted for good. The Western left and the Western right now compete over different issues. Finally, it's become possible for us to stop looking at the history of the Soviet Union through the narrow lens of Western politics. It's become possible, and it is also now necessary. It's true that our tolerance for the occasional gulag denier in our universities will not destroy the moral fabric of our society, and kind of fashions for hammer and sickle t-shirts will not corrupt our youth for good. But if we fail to incorporate what we know now about the Gulag into our own memory of European history and our own memory of the understanding of the West, there will be consequences, because after all, it is a part of our history too. Why did we fight the Cold War after all? Was it because crazed right-wing politicians in cahoots with the military-industrial complex and the CIA invented the whole thing and forced 2 generations of Americans to go along with it? Or was there something more important happening? Were we facing up to something very dangerous and very real? I'm not sure that we still remember what it was that mobilized us and what inspired us and what held the civilization of the West together for so long. At the same time, it's also true that if we don't study the history of the Gulag, some of what we know about mankind itself will be distorted. Every one of the 20th century's mass tragedies was unique. The Gulag, the Holocaust, the Armenian Massacre, the Nanking Massacre, the Cultural Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, the Bosnian Wars. And each one of these events had different historical and philosophical origins and arose in circumstances that will never be repeated. Only our ability to debase and destroy and dehumanize our fellow man has been and will be repeated again and again. Our transformation of neighbors into enemies, our reinvention of victims as lower or lesser beings worthy only of incarceration or starvation or death. More that we understand about how different societies have transformed their neighbors and fellow citizens into objects, the more we know of the specific circumstances which led to each episode of mass murder, the better we will understand the darker side of our own human nature. I wrote my books about the Gulag and the Iron Curtain, not so that it will not happen again, as the cliche has it, because it will happen again, as we can see all around us now. We need to know why, and each story, each memoir, and each document is a piece of the puzzle. Without them, we will wake up one day and realize that we do not know who we are. Thank you very much.